Welcome. I'm Rand Wentworth. I teach environmental politics and negotiation at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm your host for this lecture series on the road to Glasgow. Glad you could be with us this morning here in the United States and around the world. In India now, I think it's about 8 in the evening. This series is co-hosted by the Center for Public Leadership and the Lewis and Gabrielle Bacon Fellowship, also the Belfer Center's Environment and Natural Resources Program, and CPIC. So in exactly 1 month to the day, representatives from over 190 countries will gather in Scotland for COP26. The stakes are high. They'll be trying to negotiate and shape some kind of global plan, some plausible plan to address climate change at a time of just unprecedented disasters around the world. Everybody wants to do something, but nations have very different perspectives on their interests and their approach. So in this series, we'll be hearing from a number of nations from around the world about their climate policies and what they hope to get out of before and after Glasgow. Now, just 2 weeks ago, if you've been part of this series, you know that we discussed China's climate policies and their negotiation interests. China by far is the largest builder of coal-fired plants, over 1,000, and they're the largest lender for the construction of coal plants outside of China. Just a week ago, President Xi Jinping surprised the world by announcing that China would no longer be financing the construction of coal-fired plants around the country, around the world. And of course, this is good news, but it's not as surprising as many may think. China, in fact, had not funded any new coal-fired plants in the past 6 months. And part of that is reacting to local opposition in the various countries where they're making these loans to the horrendous air pollution that these coal-fired plants are causing. So China is in part launched the Belt and Road Initiative in the hopes of attracting international goodwill. And then they found that this backfired when people didn't want the air pollution in their backyard. Surprise. So all politics is local. There's an increasing cost of coal, and it's actually becoming cheaper in many countries to build solar arrays and wind turbines. So today we will turn our attention to an entirely different culture and set of interests in India. India is the world's largest democracy. It's also the second largest after China holder of coal-fired power plants. And I'm really eager to hear and explore the dynamics in India and whether the dynamics that caused China to begin to shift its attitude about coal plants is also at play in India. So we have 2 moderators today, and I'll briefly introduce them. Swapan Mehra served as vice president in the Indian government, vice president of the Waste to Wealth mission at the office of the principal scientific advisor. He also founded one of India's leading environmental advisory firms, Iora Ecological Solutions. He is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, very prestigious, and we're proud that he is at the Harvard Kennedy School, a candidate for the Master in Public Administration degree. Second, introducing our speaker today is Amita Ramachandran, and she was the Chief Operating Officer and founding team member of the India Climate Collaborative, India's largest collaborative platform bringing philanthropy and business together to fight climate change. And in the past, she worked in microfinance, and she also is a candidate for a master's in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School. So Amita, with these opening comments, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Rand. So I'm honored to get to introduce Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri today. A highly admired statesman, Ambassador Puri's professional focus has been on issues relating to the environment, climate change, and sustainable development. He was a lead negotiator for India at the UN on issues relating to the post-2015 development agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development. He was a key member of India's delegation at various climate change negotiations, including the Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC in Copenhagen in December 2009, and before that in Montreal, Bali, Bonn, and Poznan. Mr. Puri is the former Indian ambassador to the European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Nepal, and a member of the Indian Foreign Service since 1982. And a deputy permanent representative of India to the United Nations during a period when India was on the Security Council. Thank you so much, Ambassador Puri, for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amita and Ran. Good morning and good evening to all of the attendees of this webinar. We'll get started now. We'll start with Ambassador Puri delivering his opening remarks. This will be about 15 to 20 minutes, and Ambassador Puri, based on his extensive experience, will give us a background of India's position and India's achievements in the UNFCCC negotiation process. Also highlight a little bit on India's domestic climate policy. We'll then follow this up with a brief discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll take questions from the audience. While Ambassador Puri is speaking, I request all of you in the audience to kindly place questions that you might have in the chat, because we have about 15 minutes, and I see that there are a number of members who've joined this webinar. Thank you so much for your interest. And then we'll pick some of the most pertinent questions which have not already been responded to. And then we'll request you to then ask your questions to Ambassador Puri directly. So with this, no further ado, I hand over to Ambassador Puri for his opening remarks. Thank you so much, sir.
Swapan, thank you very much, and a very good morning to all of you. At the outset, please allow me to thank the Kennedy School, your program. I want to thank you, Swapan, in particular, Amita, Professor Benchworth, and Kevin for inviting me. Look, I have not had, as I've told some of you, the great benefit of a wonderful American education that too at Harvard. I'm a homegrown Indian product. I worked in the Indian Foreign Service for 38 years. I did have a great opportunity to work for more than 10 years at the United Nations or UN-related matters, including 5 years at New York. And a lot of that period was focused on sustainable development and climate change. Now, let me say this. I happen to have been in that small room in Copenhagen when this BASIC and President Obama's meeting happened. So at some stage, my own version will also come out, but I'd be happy to share some tidbits about that too. I was India's lead negotiator in the lead up to the SDGs and all those various aspects. Post-retirement, I am settled in Delhi, and I'm with the Environment and Research Institute, TERI, as a distinguished fellow. The areas that I focus on are really climate diplomacy in the bigger sense. I don't know what to say, but if in a lighthearted manner, if I'm allowed to say so, it is quite possible if the events of November 2020 had been different, we wouldn't have been holding this particular webinar altogether. And I think many in the world slept in the last 4 years. Perhaps me too. I switched off and said, look, an area where I was sort of very keen and interested. I don't know how to charge up the world and how to take things forward. But then the great American people stepped in, 8 million of them in any case, on the other side, and look at the wow change that has happened. From my perspective, I have negotiated all my life for policy space for India. So some people can turn around to say that this chap is almost akin to a naysayer, not really not unbeliever, but a naysayer. Now, I want to dispel any of those thoughts. After more than 20 years of being involved with all of this, let me tell you, I feel that, we must do something. Just as the last 150 odd years, one letter, C, which stands for carbon, has in various ways changed the way humankind lives life. And that includes people like me coming from India, obviously the United States and elsewhere. The same way the human mind needs to find those solutions, perhaps to start with, which are regulatory, but later on a completely game-changing solution, such that we keep on energizing our economic activities, our life indeed, but at the same time avoid these heat-trapping gases, which I'm sure in the generation of our great-grandfathers, nobody really thought about this kind of particular thing happening. In any case, many may have confused them with water vapor, which after all is the largest greenhouse gas, but which is a normal product, and we have to learn to live with it. So I made these opening comments only to make this general point. I am a free citizen of India, and so I do not speak on behalf of the government of India. I have no connection with any of them. I have a certain involvement and, let me say, a certain worldview on where we go. I'll also like to make one or two other points which many of us from India hesitate to make, and rightly so, especially in global fora, but this I take as a closed forum. I'm happy to see several of my friends and senior colleagues there, and I want to thank them very much for taking advantage of Swapan's generosity in sharing the link. So thank you for that. India is the only G20 country where the per capita income is just about $2,000. Please note why I say this. I think we need to understand what this means. This fundamentally means that among all the countries in the world, the larger countries in the world, the G20 economies, to take just one subset, India is the country with the largest amount of development needs. Now, I'm a strong believer in these needs being sustainably done. No issue on that count at all. But let us be very, very clear that switching out is a very, very impossible task. Rather, it cannot be advocated by anyone in India. So climate agenda, action on climate change in India can never, at least for many, many years, be dealing with our development agenda. The second thing I want to point out is that, India is in a vulnerable geography. Now, you mentioned all these forest fires in California, things happening in Germany and Belgium, things happening in Australia. In India, the kinds of catastrophes that we've seen, the kinds of changes that we've seen, we know what they are. But what is the answer? Of course, one answer lies, let's see what we can do about the use of carbon. And I completely understand with that. But at the same time, let us remember that what is happening today is as a result of what happened 100 years back, or at least 60, 70 years back. So even though COVID resulted in perhaps the first time in the world that greenhouse gas emissions fell by 7 to 8%, what really has been the impact in terms of global warming? Very little. We've had so the need for adaptation is something which is just simply forgotten by people. It remains less than a poor cousin. It's a talking point. Nobody seems to know what to do. Rather, perhaps they don't want to know what to do and take things forward. But for India, it is an absolute imperative. And let me also link this with development. If there is any kind of glitch or hitch or hurdling in the development pathways, which results in our being able to not even fulfill our absolute imperatives of adaptation, that will hardly be politically acceptable. And why will the country? So, when you internalize these, please understand that let's de-link India from China. I mean, on many negotiations, we sit with them. I have done that myself. That's a different matter. But in the minds of the rest of the world, there should be a clear understanding that India is a developing country with genuine felt needs, which anyone in the world would say, look, please, your people deserve a better life and you need to do something about it. If we have tectonically changed technologies, let's use them. But this is a felt need. The other place is actually now well beyond arrived kind of situation. And any limitations that they bring about. And Professor Wentworth, thank you very much for mentioning this thing, that they're making announcements that we won't do things overseas. Well, if they take domestic action, that is what will really make a difference. And, I'm not wanting to go into the geopolitics of things. Will not building coal plants sort of cut down on people's interest in BRI? Will it change the geopolitics? Let's leave all of that aside. Climate negotiations are a geopolitical negotiation, but let's leave that aside for the time being. We can come to that at a later stage. Fundamentally speaking, if there is a cutback on the utilization of coal in China, much of the world would be benefited. And if you don't mind my saying so, so is the case with your country, sir. 60%, not many people are aware, at least not in India, that more than 60% of all electricity generated in the United States come from fossil fuels. Now you use a lot of coal. There's no doubt about it. Look at what is happening in countries such as Germany. Look at what is happening with Poland, even the Europeans. The latest set of elections, the latest set of news, people are asking kind of questions. Why are we running ahead with this? No, I don't think they will slow. The countries have taken a measured decision. They are interested in going ahead. But remember the pushbacks from rich countries like Poland, rich countries in the European Union. We have to find ways to it. We will look at India and Poland in a little while, but I very much share the ideas that we need to find substitutes and ways forward on this C word, carbon, coal, whichever way we look at it. Now, I want to make one very big point to all of you. You know, irrespective of where these global negotiations on climate change go, because let's also make the point, these negotiations are fundamentally, there is an element of global power play. There is an element of geostrategy to it. The old theory, very simple. You use more energy, you have more GDP, well, you do have power. I think we need to understand that quite clearly. We are sitting among adults here. We know what exactly this means. But let us also be very clear on one thing. So this global burden sharing business, its principles, etc., is a different ballgame from climate action. And I have no doubt in my mind that irrespective of positions that India may take at the global climate talks, which are essentially about policy space. And you know, this is something many of my colleagues in the domestic civil service, etc., very often get, you know, they not just get confused, but they forget about these issues. But for those of us who have been exposed to the world and the way things happen, and let me tell you, sit at the Security Council table and you grow up very, very fast. You realize what happens. And I was fortunate to have had this exposure, not particularly happy at what I saw and felt. But policy space for countries is particularly important. And I often used to tell my colleagues, look, you are welcome to take the most difficult decision, which you think I was trying to stop. No, but I want the right to be yours. And that is something which is extremely important and needs to be underscored. So let me make the point. Irrespective of what happens in the negotiation, India, this geography, India, will be one of the largest points of action for climate action in the coming few years, decade. There should be no doubt in anybody's mind. The reason I mentioned to you vulnerabilities, the adaptation side. Let me leave out the adaptation. Let me look at what we are doing about greening things in India. You know, there is a realization here. This realization has a kind of political acceptance here. There is a realization here even among the largest companies. In fact, let me tell you, two of India's largest companies, one run by somebody who is among the top 1 or 2 people in the world, and the other company, which is somebody who's becoming one of the largest players in the world. In their recent annual general body meeting, their announcements were, renewables are the new oil. So think about the realization which is dawning about me. And then let me come to India's facts. We pledged that we'll have a reduction in the energy intensity of our GDP. We pledged that we will raise the proportion of energy produced in the energy generation capacity from non-fossil fuel, i.e. renewables, and we'll increase forest cover. On all 3 parameters, vis-a-vis the Paris Declaration and the Paris commitments, the only country in the G20 which is generally accepted to be online is India. And what else have we done? Suo motu, declared that we will up our renewables target to a huge number, 450 gigawatts in the next 8 years. Many people would say, how are you going to do it? You are at 100 today. That's the collaboration. That's the action. But that's the policy direction of the government. We'll electrify the Indian railways, one of the oldest railway systems in the world. But, you know, still chugging away on diesel in several areas. There's not much coal. There's hardly any coal. But diesel in several areas. Electrify the whole thing. Look at the lowering of the amount of GHGs that could be produced simply as a result of it. Electric vehicles, late into the game. But today, every single company in India, every single car manufacturer says, I must have in my line an EV. The place where I stay in Delhi, people are setting up multiple points for charging. It'll have to catch up. But let me make one point to you. India may not be the greatest point of innovation, but it is one of the greatest points of immediately implementing good innovation. The best examples of what we are doing here: internet, mobile telephony. It's just not for nothing that we have the largest base of mobile telephone users, of apps and so on. Once the technology is there, reasonably proven, we are the first ones to say, why not? And there are companies and people in India, not only the young people, old established companies are willing to get in. So remember that India will be a place for great action. Now let me turn to one or two other issues. Of course, our great needs are capacity building, finance. This is a very important area, and I'll come to this climate justice and all in a little while. And Amita, please stop me once I go beyond 20 minutes, because I have this habit of simply not letting go of the pulpit. I mean, nobody likes giving up a pulpit. On finance, I want to make one point. Is it a bargaining chip to get people to sign up to net zero? Is it something other than that? If I tell you about what happened in Copenhagen, you would say that, yes, it is some kind of bargaining chip, and why should we play the game? I have no problem with that. But I want to make a simple point. It is not only a question of concessional finance being made available. It is also a question of a level playing field in the area of finance. Let me give you a little example. I don't know if you are aware. Let me take a country like India. I'm not sure what will be the chances of our being able to access concessional finance such that the developed world will be willing to come up. But if not, at least we should be in a level playing field to access the money markets internationally. And what is the situation today? Cost of capital in all developing countries, including India, is far higher than the developed world. Risk of projects in India is much higher. I'm only talking about India, but it's true for the entire developed world. At the very least, should we find a mechanism to do three things? One, taxonomy, one in which there's a level playing field for us guys here, and not that all our projects fall short of being green, or they're green with a very small g. That's one of the key elements that needs to be done. Others are running ahead. The Europeans are running ahead, developing their taxonomy. We're not even part of the discussion. But should we not be included? Should our concerns not be taken into account? Secondly, de-risking, insurance, this entire business. I mean, we're talking about adaptation needs. Do think if the flood, sea level rises, etc. happen, maybe governments won't even be in a position to meet the kind of cost which will be required. But leave all that aside. At least are we in a position to provide the necessary finance to ensure that first loss guarantees are there. The technical point, but very, very important. You're doing a new technology. What is the chance of it happening or not happening? Will you run away and say, otherwise jack my prices up? Is there somebody who's willing to say, if there's the first loss, we'll do the guarantee? Multilateralism. Can you do just that? You have higher credit ratings. Your higher ratings allow you to borrow at a cheaper rate. It tilts the balance. I just want to leave this thought. Technology. What should I say? I used to be 20 years back as part of an Indo-American group, along with others from the major economies, in various discussions on what we can do with technology. I find that today the same discussions are going. If I give you the example of COVID, what is it that we are happening? Are we willing to share any technology? The answer is no. And COVID has been, let me say, something of a very great, immediate, strong hit. And the whole world, from a small Pacific island to the United States of America, everybody is impacted. People are dying, and they're dying in front of you. Yet, at best, we are willing to say, I'll donate 1 million vials, I'll donate 5 million. No one willing to say, I'll let you decide how you do it. Are we going to do this in the area of renewables? And again, I'm not talking about things which are tried and tested. Solar panels, is that. Those are all questions of scale, doing things better, and so on and so forth. But are we willing to look at tectonic changes? Let me just give the one example. I'm not a chemist. I'm not an expert. I can't give an answer to this or what the future could behold. But let's look at hydrogen. And I have a colleague, I can see him there, who's a great proponent of methanol. I don't want to touch that. I'm not an expert at all to talk about these things. But let's look at hydrogen. If supposing the good minds of the world came together and worked on hydrogen, I have little doubt that in about 5 to 10 years, we may be able to actually be willing to roll out hydrogen even in far-flung places of the world. In a sense, our oil companies actually have the infrastructure. There might be other kinds of infrastructure which might be possible. I don't know the answers to this. I'm neither a chemist nor a chemical engineer. But I do believe that the efficacy of all of these things would need to be proven among those who have the greatest abilities to be able to do this. It's not just that the research is simple, the engineering of it is not so simple. And once that happens, there will be a great change in the world. I very much count that the human mind, which brought us into this quagmire, will be the human mind which shall break. We will see this in agriculture. We will see this in every different field. It doesn't mean that I'm simply sitting back with my mouth open and saying, let the human ingenuity's apple fall in my mouth. No, I mean, we should work together. We have the great example of agriculture. We did save the world from hunger, isn't it? Now, I'm not saying it'll happen again, because that was a global sweet spot just after the Second World War. Just as 1990s was a sweet spot where there was no one else except one country at the top, many things were given. It's not the case today. Today, everybody is conscious that I don't want to give my business. My answer is, please don't give your business, but please develop the business, because you have the capacity. After that, each and every one of us will find ways and means of being part of that technology one way or the other. At least for India, I can say that very, very clearly. Now, of course, partnerships are very important. We have the International Solar Alliance, the CDRI. The United States has joined the CDRI. Very good for all of that. But I want to make one general point and one specific one with the negotiation. The general one is, let's be very clear that climate change is only one subset of living more sustainable. It is only one SDG, but let us also understand that the entire business is not just decarbonizing. There is an entire element of sustainability. And let's be more focused on the world being more responsible towards the world being more responsible towards a more sustainable consumption, more sustainable production in particular. I think that's something if we paid attention to and made that part of our global mindset. With the SDGs 2030, unlikely, but let's say 2035. Do we make this an element that we integrate climate change with sustainability? In my opinion, particularly important. Now, Amita, since I see that it's going to be 8 p.m. our time, which is about half an hour, let me just touch on this one little subject. The great global push is for net zero. But for this is a group of people who are educated, the game is not global net zero. If it was, I don't think many countries, including India, would really be so terribly, let me say, hesitant on it. But the game is global net zero for every country to sign up individually, which means, in effect, of course, no differentiation. Secondly, there is a big question of, are you going to be fair with the distribution of the balanced carbon space? And the answer is, it seems apparently not. Look at the Quad statement, which is the last time that large countries in the democratic world came together, which is just a few weeks back. Meeting the Paris commitments, striving towards 1.5 and striving towards global net zero, preferably by 2050, keeping into account national circumstances. I mentioned to you India's circumstance right at the beginning. Please be mindful of this. This net zero by 2050, I'd frankly like to know. It's good to throw up these kind of challenges, but you need to be mindful of national circumstances, let alone historic responsibility and differentiation, which are absolutely key and which can't be just wished away, because justice and fairness is not an unimportant element of the way the world negotiates and goes forward. No collaborations, no finance, no justice, then, well, we'll all see what happens. I'm not saying doomsday. I think there will be collaboration, small baby steps, some in finance, and some in terms of fairness. But fairness is particularly important because people then have a feeling that they are part of the solution and not that they were corralled into coming onto it. Similar is the case with this business of 1.5 degrees. We all understand aspirations, but it can't be the case. We're all working towards the Paris goals. Let us at least achieve that. If you keep shifting the goalposts, like this, what are you going to achieve? That everybody who is good becomes bad at a constant business in every single way. You need to do a degree of incentivization, putting things together. So I'm not against 1.5, I'm for it. But let's at least achieve the Paris agreements, which we all agreed to. And please note, you're sitting in a country which walked out for 4 years and it's come back. Your presence, and more than that, your domestic action is important. Professor Wentworth, before I stop, let me leave a question for all of you there. International action, I don't think the United States will falter. Domestic action, I'm waiting to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Puri, for that very comprehensive overview of India's position. I really appreciate the fact that you covered everything from India's historic position in terms of equity in the climate global space, the strong domestic action that not only Indian government, but Indian corporates are taking. Also about this really interesting insight into how finance is not only about just top-down dissemination of resources, but a more equitable access to money markets and lending, because the credit space of the world can fundamentally affect the way we are able to invest in better resources or better resource management going forward. I want to actually build off from that point. You concluded by saying that this whole idea of equity and sharing the remaining global space when it comes to taking on these net zero targets is critical, because we obviously have very little global emission space left if you were to look at it in a time space horizon. So what are your thoughts now about what should India's position be on this idea of historical equity going into the Glasgow COP? And what would be the ideal outcomes for India from this particular COP when it comes to this idea that we should be able to still maintain some of the space for ourselves? And a third part of that question, if I may, is that how do you think this will compete with the other large emitters in the world?
Sopan, thank you very much. First, if you don't mind, I still happen to owe my loyalties to my country and my government, and country obviously all the time, but my government, and I would object to the use of the word large emitters. This is been a matter of great debate over a long time, and it's for nothing that the MEM is called the Major Economies Meeting. India at 2 tons per capita, large emitters. I mean, would you say we are large consumers of chapati and roti, and are we anything else? People are not willing to concede that we are a large economy. And so, there is an issue here. I think we must understand that this word emitters carries with it a kind of pejorative. That's the connotation. It's not just a simple action. So India is one of the lowest emitters. At per capita 2 tons, we are below the global, not just the global average, we are below the developing country average. So, but I leave this out. This is just for the sake of making a preamble. Look, I believe that at COP26 in Glasgow, and let me be very clear with you, that's not the end of the road, man. There will be more COPs after that. I was there in Copenhagen, and there have been so many more things. Global negotiations are about working on it. As I mentioned before we began this program, if November 2020 had been slightly different, none of us would be meeting even in this webinar. So the fact of the matter is that, some things have to be built up. I asked you this question about domestic action. I don't think you have an easy answer to give. So everybody will have to demonstrate action. Now, I think the world coming together is already a good thing. In Glasgow, the negotiations will be hampered by the COVID restriction. There are going to be many of these sets of issues. We are all coming together to once again give a large push. Can you do it on the first shot that you meet? I'm not sure. I don't know. But I like the idea of moving the ball forward. And for me, that is particularly important. And I think issues such as the question of what will happen to the remaining carbon space, its equitable distribution would be central to countries like India. Are people going to come together and negotiate and talk about that? I sincerely hope they will. This particular methodology of how you go about allocating the balance space will have to take into account some measure, at least, of historical responsibility. Some measure in terms of what the current scenarios are, where are the populations, etc. Something will have to come up. I sincerely hope that Glasgow sets the template for global goals. What individuals do under that is to try and contribute to those global goals. This includes net zero, etc. But at the same time, in a manner which is doable, which is realistic, and which is duly incentivized and supported. Technology, finance, in my opinion, particularly important. They mentioned that, the global market space for coal is shrinking. Look, this is the evolution of the market economy. These things happen. But let us be very strong in supporting developing countries whose needs are tremendous. And India, let me assure you, will be in the forefront of making its own commitments to taking strong climate action.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the adaptation element of climate change. You mentioned, and it's very evident from recent events, also from a lot of research and analysis, that India clearly is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And adaptation remains one of our domestic priorities. But as you mentioned, adaptation has for a while taken a sort of a backseat, a second priority in the negotiation process. Now, it's very critical for us in India to take care of our vulnerable populations, our vulnerable infrastructure. How do you think we can leverage the negotiation process of the UNFCCC towards this goal? What are the elements of this? Does this include technology, finance, or are there other such elements? And finally, what are the kind of coalitions that we can build and leverage, or we are building and leveraging, to place adaptation again at the center stage of negotiations? There are many other countries, there are small island states, there are many other countries who have equal or higher vulnerability than us. So how are we leveraging their position towards this goal?
So first, I just saw a thing in the chat box from somebody who's a very good, active individual on all of this about having a global meeting where everybody reports. But that's exactly what happens in this UNFCCC. It has two meetings, once in the time of summer, once in the winter days, and there is a great deal of reporting. In fact, the Paris Accords themselves, and before that Copenhagen, have set in place issues of monitoring, or let me say reviewing, etc., etc. But the key question in all of this is the will to do, and do as much as you can, and what your national circumstances allow you to. You mentioned a very important point about adaptation. I wish we could find some kind of numerical goals to adaptation. We've been working on it for a long time. Simply because it covers every facet of life, we are not able to agree. Perhaps it's not so easy also in terms of, let's say, energy intensity. You can say and do a lot of things. Obviously, technology, finance are important. But I would leave with you one or two areas which I think are critically and fundamentally important. One is to recognize that adaptation is an imperative. It's all right to say that you can't adapt, keep on adapting unless you do some mitigation. That's fine. But on the other hand, if you will not do adaptation, you're going to find problems for the very soon. So mainstream adaptation. Secondly, technologies available. Let's see what we can do. But financing, we must do something about de-risking, and something to do in terms of financing large scale, let me say, infrastructural oriented things, which provide a modicum for adaptation. I think that is particularly important. I could mention many things, but fundamentally speaking, money is a fungible commodity. It allows you to do many things. And if you provide a base to ensure that risking and the abilities to be able to leverage that are there, you might be doing the entire world a great favor. But you have to think creatively. And there our MDBs, the IMF, others need to join. So can you leverage what they're doing? That's for me. Coalition. Look, adaptation is the need for everyone, including the developed world. But in the developing world, the needs are tremendous because your abilities to be able to do anything are extremely limited. So, I'll give you a little example. The famous Indian author, Ghosh, the great writer, mentions two famous incidents which he was party to, which he saw, to highlight climate change. One was a tornado in Delhi University in 1997, and the other was Superstorm Sandy in New York in the year 2012, I think. I was there in both of them. Now, leave the tornado in Delhi University out. But when Superstorm Sandy struck New York, I was in a building and had to stay out for 3 weeks. It's the only building on the east side which got impacted because the East River flooded into its basement, resulting in the entire electrical structure going. Had Superstorm Sandy of a storm of that intensity struck even anywhere else in the United States, other than the city of New York, I can tell you the losses in actual human losses would have been unbearable and unimaginable. But because it hit the strongest place, the ability to bounce back, the ability to be able to take the hit is tremendous. So let's not underestimate what development does in terms of resilience, in terms of adaptation, but you must work on these things, build better, build back after COVID, greener, as well as more resilient. I think these things are absolutely important. Which are the countries? The entire developing South. I think the entire developing South is important. But when I look at countries in terms of the India type of vulnerability, I certainly look at Indonesia. It's a country which has even greater because of its coastline, the way it is spread. Many of the island nations have the same thing. But again, looking at larger countries in the world, many countries in Africa, West Coast as well as East Coast of Africa, again have the same vulnerability. ASEAN has vulnerabilities, Philippines. All these countries certainly need to come together and ring the bell on adaptation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Puri. My final question, and then we'll move to the audience's question. And I urge other audience members to also please type your questions in the chat. We'll just begin with sharing some of these in a couple of minutes. So my last question, Ambassador Puri, and I'll request that if we can discuss this in 2 minutes, because I know we have many people who are interested, is on financing. So when we discussed in the build-up to this event, we had this really interesting discussion about this $100 billion of financing that is committed from the developed to the developing world. It's now going to be discussed again in Glasgow. You also mentioned very interestingly that it's not only about just transferring funds, but about leveraging markets. How do we, in effect, make a connect between this very large amount of resources that is supposed to be transferred, the actual tools of how this should be transferred, and then the need on the ground, which is resilient building for India's farmers, or resilience building in really small rural settlements in island nations? How do we make that transition of resources very quickly, because the clock is ticking and we are running out of time? And how can the COP process support in this?
Soban, you've raised very fundamental questions. If you will give me a minute, let me entertain your entire set of viewers. In Copenhagen, everybody talks about the meeting of BASIC with President Obama. That basically hammered out the issue, which later on led to voluntary commitments. But basically that led to the issue that everybody's commitments will be reviewed. And that's what the Copenhagen BASIC meeting with President Obama did. Financing was not discussed there. They then moved to a slightly bigger room. And there the issue of financing came up because there were many more countries involved out there. And the two issues came. It said we will do $30 billion in the years up to 2020 and $100 billion a year after that. Do you know what happened? President Obama had to stop the meeting and say, I cannot agree to 30 billion in the coming few years. And the excuse was, of course, and a good excuse, I don't disagree, that Congress has to support that. I understand that. And that's how the word called approaching 30 billion entered these negotiations. And I'm afraid the idea of approaching remains. From somewhere monies will be cobbled up together. But I remain very, very clear in my mind that monies are important, monies matters. But can we use not just the money which comes in large tranche for certain countries which need aid finance, which need grant finance? There is no other way. Small economies, what is their ability to be able to leverage market? But the amounts of money that would be available, for example, $100 billion is, the kind of monies that we are looking at in India. Somebody did some research some time back and said that we require about $1 trillion worth of adaptation money from now for the next 5 or 6 years. And around the time of the year 2030, you might require $1.5 trillion. Now, these are, of course, guesstimates in various ways. We can look on them. These kind of monies would require for large economies like India to be able to leverage the capital market. Therefore, in my opinion, grant finance is very important and its numbers must be increased because there are so many countries in the world which have no choice but to take concessional finance, and they need it because their vulnerabilities are great. At the same time, for larger economies, you must have a fund which can be used for leveraging and which you can then use for their having more equitable access to the capital market, at the same time de-risking, which is a particularly important element in taking things forward, using the monies that you have.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Puri. Now we'll move to some questions from the audience. I'll first request my colleague Shashank to address this question because it's related to the multilateral process that we were just talking about. I request members of the audience to kindly limit your question to a minute, and also request if you end with a question. If you have any profound observations, please do put them in the chat and we'll discuss them. But if you have a question, please let's close it with a question for Ambassador Puri. So Shashank, over to you.
Thank you, Swapin. Ambassador Puri, it's such an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. My name is Shashank and I'm a master's student at the Kennedy School. My question is, you have an immense experience with these multilateral institutions like the UN. Do you think the space that these institutions is creating for these countries to come together and discuss these issues, do you think it's adequate to drive the collective action at a global level at the scale at which we need? Or if not, what do you think are the changes that we need in these institutional spaces to move the needle forward? Thank you.
Swapan, shall I take this question or do you want to
Yes.
collect a few questions and then?
Yes,
I should take the question.
Yes,
yeah. Shashank, look, I am an old and convinced believer that multilateral institutions have done a good job, but they need to reform. And if they reform and we bring in more of those who can be major stakeholders in taking things forward, it will add to multilateralism's heft. And that certainly means, look at the G20 kind of format, for example. You bring in the largest developing countries with a great degree of heft and interest and abiding faith in multilateralism. Can you utilize their power too, or you want to remain the way you are? These are answers the world has to find itself. For my side, that is absolutely important. But on the other question that you mentioned, their pace, is it glacial? Is it good? Not. But look, it is a pace which does allow everybody to internalize and feel a certain degree of ownership. We may not have thought very much about the Copenhagen Accord, yet we went along. We may have, wishy-washily looked towards Paris, but we went along. We remain committed. This is the process which brings in a degree of, let me say, de jure acceptance and legitimacy. Now, for many countries, that's important. We can, of course, turn around and say the largest countries in the world can do everything and everything will happen. Will it? As something of this scale, it couldn't happen in the case of COVID. How are you going to see it in the scale of climate change? You really need a greater buy-in for everyone, which means you need to take others along. It's a bit of a slow process, but it's been a slow process for a long time. As we build up the momentum and tempo, you see that everybody wants to do something. I believe that in most parts of the developing world, people do what they can. Their abilities are limited. Their capacities are also limited.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. Now I'll request Steve Fisher. Steve, if you can unmute and address the question to Ambassador Puri.
Yeah, thank you very much. You emphasized in your earlier remarks that India is a developing country and you want to see India develop and people deserve a better life. India's energy use per capita is a fraction of the US and about a third of China's. So if they were to get to a fully developed China's, I think it's about a third. That's a lot of building that needs to take place. And so really, I don't know how you do that. It's a really two-part question. The first part is how do you do that without basically getting the rest of the world to subsidize you, which comes down to a question of how do you decide, how much do I decide, say in the United States, I need to subsidize India, subsidize China at the expense of my own people. How do we put a value on that? And the second part, unrelated, is why is nuclear such a tiny part of China's energy generation? It's only about 2% of your energy generation just from coal alone. So historically, is there a reason for that?
Steve, if you could also just quickly introduce yourself, Steve, and if possible, turn on a camera, but introduce yourself.
All right, hang on, I'll turn the camera on. Yeah, I'm a Harvard graduate. I've been working in the energy space for quite a long time. I have a lot of interest in what you're talking about here. Also involved in a project trying to build a number of recycling plants to recycle cardboard in the United States into pulp to send to India and China, because China has banned the importation of wasted recycled cardboard because it's a waste. So our goal is to recycle the cardboard here into pulp, send it to China, and we're trying to raise money, and it's very difficult to raise money. Again, your question about cost of capital, our cost of capital is quite high. So all of these things relate to my interest. I'm a 77 graduate of Harvard and an 82 graduate of the business school. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Ambassador Puri.
Professor Fisher, fantastic questions. So let me try in my limited manner to try and answer them. The first one about nuclear. You know, you and I perhaps have contributed to making it a bad word, isn't it? Let's leave India, China out of the equation. Let's look at Germany, a country which had actually been managing fairly well with nuclear power plants. And look what happened. These are people's perceptions. What do? I personally think that there are elements in the nuclear technology which might be able to make many things happen, even though today there are expensive various things to do. Are we in a position to ramp this up? But none of us are even talking about it. Even the great technologists of the world are not talking about it. So we've almost said no to it. But I wish we would consider and see what we can do to it. But so that's the best answer that I can give to you. Why isn't greater in China or greater in India? India is trying to do, but the costs are pretty high, and we all need to understand what that means. In your own country, you're a little slow. There is a certain kind of global politics. I don't have the answers to that, but perhaps science would be able to reassure humankind in a better manner. I don't know the answers, as I say. Coming to the question of who's subsidizing whom. Look, isn't this a kind of debate which, at least as far as the entire business of the climate negotiations and discussions is concerned, where when the entire framework convention was negotiated, everyone agreed on the issue of differentiation. Now the question is, people turn around and say, but I'm subsidizing you, but what does it mean you're subsidizing? You're emitting 16 tons and your consumption rates on everything are tremendously high. I mean, I'm building with my own thing, and you say, yes, you are eating into my plant. Yes, true, but you have been not only doing it for 150 years, even today you're doing it at 8 times the amount that I'm doing. So the fact of the matter is, on all of these, we will have to come to a certain kind of, via media between ourselves. This is what global negotiations are about. You have a point. I have many points to make, but that doesn't mean the one point that you have is not important. We will have to sit together, and I think if cooler heads try and come together, we have to find ways where there is a degree of not just equity in mathematical terms, but equity which is perceived to be acceptable to everyone. Because at the end of the day, these are global negotiations. They are about perception, and they are about a feeling that somehow or the other, there will be some kind of gain. At the UN, the general talk is never of gain. We love using the words win-win. At the UN, the general talk is that if everybody loses, it's a damn good deal. Now, this is the kind of things we'll have to come together as a world. And I notice that we do. It takes a little bit of time, much more banging of the heads together. If the United States, for example, starts moving much more away from fossil fuels into renewables, even maybe nuclear, I don't know the answers to all of that. Let me tell you, its spin-off effects in the world will be tremendous. Many countries, India included, many others, would look at your corporates, what they are doing, bring those technologies here, and see that in the future, this is the way the world is going. And so how can you be left out of that world? The rest is yesteryears. Phase outs will become economically not just feasible, but economically necessary, because even fashionability of things will start changing. So, you have let me say, a great deal of responsibility, not just in terms of actual doing, but in terms of the fact that you influence the world in an unbelievable manner. And that's important. You may say that we are hiding behind that, but the fact of the matter is that's the nature of the way the construct is, and we look to you for this leadership.
Interrupting, Ambassador Puri, we just have a couple of questions and we're almost out of time. So, Mandeep, I think Ambassador Puri partly addressed your question that the UNFCCC COPs need to review. I'll also urge you to go and just Google and read about global stocktake. This is a process that the UN has set up to review how countries are achieving their goals. And then RB, I'm so sorry, but I'll just phrase a question to Ambassador Puri because we are very short of time. RB asked the question, Ambassador Puri, that India also faces hardships in terms of health, challenges and to its ecosystems from coal usage. You mentioned this about China. So how do we reconcile the fact that we need a lot of coal? It's not only about global commitments, but also about the fact that it's affecting our ecosystem. And is that affecting our domestic policy choice?
Swapan, you are so right. There are a lot of friends of mine who are making these analyses about coal plants in India on a constant basis. And several of them say that the cost benefit analysis perhaps doesn't go in favor of that. Today, I think the balancing point about coal in India is a very simple one. With all the hydropower, with all the renewable energy that we are pushing for, including the little bits of nuclear that we have, the need in India, given the kinds of technology, is that you require thermal power, at least for the balancing portion, because we are not yet in a position that we can simply get rid of it and do anything. This will take a very long time. We are also not a country which is very fortunate in terms of hydrocarbons, that is petroleum products. So we can't just go to a lower GHG emitter from coal to going to a petroleum product. We have a serious issue on this. And the need for greater production of electric power is something that everybody agrees. So, if I mention 100% railway electrification, electric vehicles, somewhere or the other, the electric power will have to be produced. As things currently stand, it seems pretty difficult to simply say, stop, zero, no more. That's difficult. But the realization that it's a tough call is there with everyone, including the corporates, including some of those who might have an interest in this particular area of business.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Puri. That's a very hopeful note for us to conclude. This has been a very, very enriching session. You've spoken about very, very important critical issues going into the Glasgow, but as you also mentioned, Glasgow is not the end of the world. This is a process which takes time, both at a domestic and a global front. We heard from Ambassador Puri about the need for differentiation, about the need for deep analysis, as a lot of countries are announcing these net zero targets. Whatever residual emission space we have, we need to equitably distribute it. This is probably the last opportunity that we have of institutionalizing this equity, and this is something we must push forth. I think that the rationale behind really pushing for adaptation is very, very clear. Most of the world is now suffering consequences of climate change, and how we route resources and just even priority and empathy towards the need of the resilience is something I think that we need to all contribute towards. And I know that policy is sometimes agnostic to empathy, but that's a connect that many of us here at the Kennedy School are learning how to make, Ambassador Puri. Finally, your views on financing were really, really interesting. I think a lot of us relate to this because we are trying to study global financial markets here, and also this connect to how it can be leveraged, not only using climate financing as pure play grants, but how we can use climate financing to de-risk and leverage other markets is something that we'd love to follow up on and do some work on. Lastly, very encouraging, Ambassador Puri, that you mentioned that multilateralism is still alive and still healthy, and we still have hope from the multilateral institutions. And so we are very excited now about following up with you post-Glasgow as to what happened there and how we can really build up from the momentum for achieving some of these goals. So thank you very much again for accepting our request, Ambassador Puri. And this was a very, very enriching, very, very stimulating session. And now I hand over to Rand for his closing remarks. Thank you.
Swapan, thank you. And thank you, Ambassador Puri. This has been an extraordinary, rich discussion. Thank you for sharing your years of experience and wisdom in the United Nations and your leadership in climate. We are honored that you would share your thoughts. I, in particular, appreciate the local circumstances of India as it strives to develop and meet the legitimate needs of its people. And at the same time, what an impressive record of implementation and meeting the Paris Accord and then stretching beyond that. So thank you. Thank you for representing India in your career and now in this session today. To our audience, our next in the series of the Road to Glasgow will be on October 12th at 5 p.m. We are honored to have Dan Reifsnyder, who co-chaired the UN negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement on climate change. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks to all.
And may I just make one small point? You are very fortunate in having Dan Reifsnyder, one of the most outstanding negotiators, friend of mine, and an absolutely brilliant guy. Wish you all the best, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, Ambassador, you should join us for that
I
conversation.
will. Please send me the link.
It would be a great
I would be
reunion.
very happy to do so. I would. He's such an outstanding American and an outstanding individual for the world. Great guy. Thank you.
We agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.